Hello and welcome to Sociology, Culture, and Diversity for the Medical Sciences. So today we're going to be talking about health and illness. As you're going to see running throughout this book, we really have two common themes that we're exploring. We're looking at culture and linguistic competency, and then we're looking at the heritage chain. The idea is we need to understand diversity, and then we need to really kind of figure out how people ended up exactly the way they did, why they identify with the cultures that they do, and then understand multiple common ways of life. We're going to take a cultural perspective to this, looking at the common way of life and then how that common way of life developed over time as that society, that culture that produced society evolved. And then we're also going to be looking at forms of stratification, the ways we divide into groups, but then really the systematic effects of that. Because the groups that we identify with are not only associated with our culture, our way of life. It's also associated with our access. So when we think about this class, we need to think, how does our culture affect attitudes and beliefs toward health and illness? But then how does our access as a result of identifying with specific groups affect our health and our illness? So not only are we thinking about cultural variables like people's attitudes toward health and illness, but we really need to be looking at the systematic structures are in place that determine somebody's access to health and illness. And this is where the idea of diversity and cultural competency comes in, because we need to understand the experiences of minorities. Now, the idea of being a minority is you are in a subjugated social position, and our minority status is often based upon the groups that we identify with. So it's very important to realize the effects of the group that you identify with, and then how that influences your cultural ideology, and then how that influences your access, systems and structures that are in place. Okay? So again, when it comes to cultural and linguistic competency, we not only have to understand the diverse cultures that are out there, but we have to understand the divergent experiences that people have, especially when it comes to things like access to healthcare. So again, the heritage chain is something that's going to be a theme you're going to see throughout the book. It's going to be repeated over and over and over again, but that's kind of really digging into your head is, how do these ethnicities, these races, these culture or ideas, form over time? And then why is it that we identify with these things? And then how does that shape our behavior? Again, so how does our culture, our way of life shape the way we think about life and our access to life? How has are the socialization process, us being socialized into a way of life, influenced the way we think, for example? Okay, so then the heritage chain is somebody's entire culture. And then what is culture but all the variables such as country of origin, the way you live, the type of food you eat, the cars that you drive, what you think is important, your values, your religion, your language, your philosophy of life. All of this is built into your culture. And then our culture is something that has been developed over time through social interaction. As people interact with one another, we produce society. We produce culture, which is a structure of society. Okay? But again, in this class, we're looking at, all the different cultures that we've socially constructed over time and being aware of that so that we'd have a culturally relativistic attitude, not an ethnocentric attitude. Okay, so we want to be, thinking about where's somebody else coming from, not trying to take their perspective and to put it into our box, for example. Okay, so health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well being. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean the absence of disease. And how we phrase health, how we interpret health, how we express health, how we feel that we should feel, etc., is influenced by our cultural attitudes and ideologies. Do we think it's acceptable to admit when we're sick, for example, or do we try to bottle that up? How do we cope with that kind of thing? How do we cope with life and everything that it throws at us from, birth to death and then all the phases in between? And then health is not just a physical thing, it's also a psychological thing. So another thing you're going to be seeing throughout this book is that biopsychosocial approach, meaning, how do we treat the body and then how do we treat the mind? And then how is all of that influenced by the social context? Okay. So again, health is culturally defined. our standards, our measures for what is healthy is culturally defined. Okay. In the United States, we might look at health as something like how many years you've lived, and somebody else might look at it as quality of life, for example. But the idea is we need to look at it as from a physical standpoint, our physical body's health, and then the state of the mind. But remember that all things that affect the mind affect the body, and the body affects the mind. Because again, the body communicates with the brain and the brain communicates with the body, and everybody's talking. Again, it's a biopsychosocial process when we look at health, okay? Health maintenance and disease protection. Again, this is associated with culture. In specific societies like those that are technologically advanced, we have this ability to engage in maintenance culture. But other, cultures in other countries, for example, that might not have the high economic status, this idea of maintaining health might be a completely different attitude toward that. Okay. So again, the ability to maintain health is influenced by socioeconomic status. How much money do you have? Do you have access to health care? How much coverage do you have? Can you pay for the medicine? Can you pay for the surgeries? And then the other side of it's the cultural side. For example, do men seek out medical assistance more than women? Why is it that men seek out less medical advice than females, for example? And then how does that affect their health maintenance, for example? Are men going to doctors as much as women to make sure their health is maintained? And if they're not, what kind of consequences is that having for the group of men, for example? Okay. Same thing with disease protection. How much of disease protection is associated with education? If we go around and we have a great education system and we have ability to disseminate that kind of information and make people aware of the truth and how to help with these things, we can lower statistical rates of things like AIDS, for example, and other sexually transmitted disease, things like that. Okay. Same thing when it comes to pollution. How can we, if we have education and we have laws in place that reduce pollution that doesn't affect the water, how is that affecting the lung care of people? Because there are cities in the world where you look at their pollution rates on an average day, and it's very detrimental to their health. So again, the idea of health maintenance is an environmental process. It's a psychological process. It's a body process. Do you feel sick? Do you need to go see someone? Okay. And then all of this is again influenced by socioeconomic status. Countries that can afford to not pollute can maybe take the steps, but other countries who can't afford it, who need coal, for example, desperately, they don't care about the pollution. They need to build concrete, for example, to build houses because that's their only means to like provide. They don't care about the pollution resulting from making bricks. Okay, so health is not equitable globally. You have to think about health on a global perspective. One, what country are you living in? And then where are you located within that country compared to other people? And where you're located in that country according to other, compared to other people is associated with groups that you identify with. Such as do white Americans in America have more access to health care than African Americans or Asian Americans? Okay, and so we need to be thinking about these sociocultural variables when it comes to things like health equity and health disparities. Why do men not seek, doctors as much as women? And then why does one race have more access to healthcare than another race, for example? And in order to understand that question, we have to understand the history of subjugation and how Europeans dominated society and subjugated entire groups of people, the minorities that we know today, based upon ethnicities, races, things along those lines. Okay, they have been stuck into minority status. And so when you push somebody into minority status, you shove someone in poverty by subjugating them into the lower classes. How does that affect their health? So when you go to ask questions like why are African Americans, experiencing higher rates of COVID than other races, for example, then we have to look at the history of poverty and how African Americans have been subjugated into poverty historically. And then how has that affected African Americans' hearts? And then how has the effect of prejudice and discrimination affected their health? Because prejudice and discrimination increases stress, a psychological factor, which then influences your immune system, a biological factor. So again, everything's connected. Biopsychosocial. It's how we're going to approach all of this. Okay. Uh, Health indicators is an interesting thing that your book talks about because again, these are trends. And so if we can get everybody on board on these trends, then we as a society can make huge changes. Like, how do we increase physical activity for groups of people? How do we reduce over being overweight and being obese? How do we reduce tobacco use and drug use, for example? How do we reduce irresponsible sexual behavior that leads to the transmission of disease, for example? How do we better help people with mental health? Okay, how do we help people avoid injury and make their neighborhood safe environment? What do we do about that environment? What are we doing about the polluted rivers? Okay, how do we use immunization and have enough money to set up a bureaucracy to be able to immunize an entire population? And how do we make access to healthcare more equitable? So again, these are all social problems, are what these are, but these are social problems that affect tons of people. Okay, and then the people that experience these problems, these are associated with other socioeconomic variables such as social class status. Is increased rates of violence associated with poverty? Absolutely. Okay, that's how you just got to put everything together. Again, in this class, we're looking at culture, and we're looking at how we're socialized into a way of life, and then we're looking at how we identify with a group, and that dictates what culture we get socialized into. But that group that we identify with, that we belong to, also influences our access, which is the end all be all. Okay, health beliefs, these are again much more influenced by culture. um Susceptibility, seriousness, taking action, these are the components of the health belief model. Okay, the idea is that providers and patients' perceptions of health and illness are influenced by their environment, influenced by their culture. Okay, so their susceptibility to this disease is influenced by where they live, for example. How seriously they take problems and whether or not they see that can be influenced by factors such as sex. Are you a male or are you female? And whether or not somebody takes action, again, is highly influenced by culture and access to healthcare. Do we actually have the power and enough money to be able to take care of them? Okay, but the idea is everybody has a different worldview, a different perspective, a different cultural idea. Even people from the same culture often have incredibly divergent ways of life. Okay, but they just, share some common bonds because of the groups that they belong to, for example. But again, one major part of cultural and linguistic competency is to be able to take things from somebody else's perspective. Okay, to be able to take it and just kind of remove your own bias, remove your own opinions, and ask yourself, where is this person coming from? And that's the beginning of being culturally relativistic. Okay, so illness, again, same thing, culturally defined. We have these biological standards, these indicators broken down, but what somebody might define as an illness, somebody else just kind of brushes off and thinks it's nothing. But the book does get into the stages of illness, again, symptoms, taking on that sick role, making the phone call to a doctor, developing that relationship with the doctor, receiving the diagnosis, going through the treatment, either it's going up or it's going down, and then dealing with the recovery. Okay. And then the illness continuum, again, the stages. You're healthy, then you develop the acute illnesses, then your status becomes a little unstable, then you get into the tertiary care of intensive care or recovery, and then depending on the way it goes is death. And this is something we're all going to have to go in through life through the stages. But again, I hope you guys are starting to pick up on some of the common themes in this class. Again, how does culture influence people's worldview? How are they socialized into that culture? How does that influence their perspective of health and illness? And then more importantly, not necessarily more importantly, but just as important is, the groups that you identify with is associated with the culture you get socialized into, and the group you identify with is also associated with your access to things like healthcare. Okay, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Email with any questions.